and good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you're tuning in from, whether that is in Brisbane here, it's 9 o'clock in the evening, 8 o'clock in the morning, Sao Paulo, Brazil, 12 o'clock p.m. in the UK. Welcome to, I guess you call it Season 2, Episode 7 of our International Perspectives on Corpus Technology for Language Learning seminar series. And we're very honored today to have Dr. Reka Jablonkai from the University of Bath in the UK. And tonight she's going to be presenting on transforming language teaching with Corpora, bridging research and practice, which for those of you who have any kind of experience of DDL scholarship or DDL kind of practice or any kind of corpus-based language pedagogy, overcoming the gap between the research findings and then putting that into practice has been a persistent issue, not just with I guess with our field of corpus-based language pedagogy, but with computer-assisted language learning as a whole, is not alone in this aspect. So we're going to be stay tuned for a really interesting take on how we can overcome that research practice gap in today's talk. Before I introduce our presenter for today, I'm just going to chip in with our acknowledgement of country, in which ourselves, as the University of Queensland, acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet, or at least the online space in which we meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, while recognizing their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So today's speaker is Dr. Reka Jablonkai, who, as she puts it in her own bio, is an award-winning assistant professor in education and applied linguistics at the University of Bath. Numerous research interests include the corpus-based discourse analysis, the use of Corpora in language teaching and multilingual education contexts. She's the lead editor of the Routledge Handbook of Corpora and English Language Teaching and Learning 2022, which I think I submitted to chapter 4, as I remember.
Yeah.
She's chair of the Corpus Call Special Interest Group of Eurocall, which I'm also pleased to be a member of. Her research projects were funded by the BAICE and the British Council and has been widely published in journals including English for Specific Purposes and ESP Today. So that's enough from me. I hope that we're going to have a great talk today with Reka, and I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now so that you can get your PowerPoint going. But Reka, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for the invitations. I'm honored to be part of this really prestigious research seminar series. I'll share my screen now. And yeah, you can see the the presentation version, not the presenter's version this time, Peter.
We've got the presentation version, Reka.
Thank you, that's great. Thank you. So I chose this topic, bridging research and practice, because it is a very important aspect of corpus-based language teaching. And there is a lot of discussion about how and why haven't we already crossed this research and practice gap. And what I'm hoping to do today is to demonstrate practical ideas, how we can do that. And towards the end of my presentation, I highlight a couple of aspects of maybe challenges that we are facing in corpus-based language teaching and a couple of suggestions for future directions where we could go and where we could look for kind of suggestions and ways to bridge this gap. So first, I will a little bit highlight what is corpus revolution and what was hoped when Corpora were first being used to linguistic analysis, but at the same time, very quickly already in language teaching. Then I will speak about the three main approaches to how to integrate Corpora into language teaching. And very specifically based on my studies in ESP, I will demonstrate how findings linguistic analysis and also findings relating to how to use Corpora can inform teaching. And then I will highlight principles for course design and a couple of aspects of how the challenges with Corpora could be overcome. So corpus revolution, that I'm sure many of you have come across this term, and also thinking about using Corpora that might transform language teaching. And this is what kind of was hoped in the 1990s and early 2000s. And this is what we are also working on. But what in reality, what happened is, I wouldn't call it a revolution, because the pace of the change is probably fairly slow. But this is also something that, for example, Leach kind of professed, that the change might be gradual rather than quick. So also Chamber in 2019 highlighted that there is still a gap between corpus research and teaching practices using Corpora. So my aim today is to demonstrate some ways of bridging this gap, and I'm just using this image, which is actually a real bridge in Germany, and it's also nicknamed the Devil's Bridge. So that seems to be a nice metaphor for us today. So the main approach is, how can we use Corpora in language teaching? Based on the direct access of learners to Corpora, we can distinguish between three main approaches. One is a corpus-informed language teaching. The other one is integrated corpus-supported teaching and learning. And finally, the third approach is self-directed data-driven learning. In my presentation today, I will go through each of these three approaches, and I will give you specific examples based on my studies in English for specific purposes, or more specifically English for professional purposes, how my studies based on actually EU English can be translated and have been translated into the teaching practice. Just one more point here. I will give these examples within English for specific purposes, and probably the kind of biggest branch of English for specific purposes where Corpora have already been really successfully used is English for academic purposes. So I would like to highlight the aspect that in my case, I will focus on English for professional purposes, where Corpora seem to be fairly rare in course materials and in teaching as well. So let's just have a quick look at what we mean by corpus-informed language teaching. So this is when Corpora are used by researchers and materials writers. They have direct access to Corpora, and they develop the materials, the content, or the sequencing of language teaching courses or syllabi based on what they find in a specific Corpora. So you can see on the slide, and I'm sure many of you know about these corpus-informed language teaching materials, Corpora-informed dictionaries, by describing the language, syllabus design. There are a couple of English language textbooks like Touchstone or Grammar and Beyond that were based on corpus analysis. Language testing has been informed by Corpora, and learner Corpora is also a very important branch of corpus linguistics that inform language teaching and learning. Now, in my a particular example, what I will share with you is focusing on a specific register, EU English. So this is the English is used in European Union institutions. And the reason why I focused on this came from the learners as EU professionals need to be able to speak English at a high level. And at universities, there are courses that focus on EU English, and there are also professional courses in EU institutions, but also in EU member countries. Now, what I did, I designed and compiled an English EU discourse corpus. And what I think what is also very important already at this stage is how do we select the texts that we include in a specialized corpus with the aim to design teaching materials and design courses. So I think it's very important to base the corpus design and corpus building on needs analysis. It's very important to identify the specific texts and genre that learners will need to be able to understand and maybe write themselves, and focus the courses on that. And for this needs analysis, I involved subject specialists who informed me about what are the specific texts or specific genre that they used during their work. So based on this needs analysis, I compiled an English EU discourse corpus with slightly over 1 million words. And this has also been balanced for the 34 different subject fields of EU activities. So all the materials that I will show you are based on this corpus. I will focus on lexical analysis, and all the examples will be related to mainly teaching vocabulary or aspects of vocabulary. So I created a word list, an EU English word list, a collocation list, and I also will share some ideas relating to lexical bundles that I also identified in the corpus. Now, just first about word lists. Again, just to highlight, word list is probably the most productive area within vocabulary teaching where corpora are used. And you can see different subject fields like business, engineering, environment, applied linguistics, all worked on developing different word lists, which can inform language teaching fairly directly. So in my case, I created the EU word list and I focused on word families, legal words, words in connection with funding, main EU institutions, geographical names, but also function words have been identified as important to be included in a pedagogical word list. Probably a kind of unique aspect of the EU word list is abbreviations, which are not normally included in word lists, but in an EU context, this was really important because there are so many EU-specific abbreviations that are used in these texts that pedagogically it was relevant that learners have a good understanding of this. Now in ESP, it's very important to validate the specificity of a word list. So what I did, I kind of tested my word list in different corpora. One of them was a small EU English corpus, but I also looked at literary text and news text, and you can see the coverage. It's fairly high, 14% in the original, my own corpus, and it's very, very low in the literary text. So it suggests that it's an EU-specific word list. I also looked at collocations based on the word list. So these are some of the lemmas that I looked at and some of their frequent collocations. And what I also did, and that might be specific for ESP, I also tried to demonstrate how the use of these individual lexical items might be different in a general corpus in general use and in the specific EU English corpus. So what you can see here, I used the concept of semantic preference and identified the different semantic sets among the collocates in the EU corpus and in the general corpus, and presenting the different semantic sets and the specific collocates that belong to these different sets, and comparing that in these two registers, and actually presenting that to students might make students aware how the specific language use is different from general language use, and that will help them to kind of use this information in their own productive writing activities. Also, one useful way to present a kind of specific collocational profile is to use the semantic categories that I identified in my study as semantic preferences. And also in this case, what you can see is I've got the different semantic sets like legislation, plan, or approach with the verb implement, and the specific collocates that belong to these semantic sets are shown in italics. And then I also gave a sample sentence where the word is used. So this is kind of a way to present what the study, the lexical analysis, found in a kind of pedagogic way, in a learner-friendly way. Also, some of this information would highlight semantic prosody, like, for example, positive collocates or negative collocates with the word implement. Now, based on this information, you can also think of some activity types. For example, raising learners' awareness about collocates, just giving the instructions to students to look at maybe the collocational profile or even concordance lists, and ask them to identify the specific collocates that they that is frequently used with the word implement, and then they can select the ones that are go with implement. And this is actually the kind of key for this activity. Now, I also looked at lexical bundles. Lexical bundles are kind of multi-word units which frequently go together. I focused on 4-word lexical bundles, and I'm just giving a couple of examples here, like in accordance with the or of the European Union, or referred to in article, which are some of the very frequent ones. What was also very interesting in the EU English corpus, that lexical bundles were often part of longer word combinations. So this suggests that EU language is very much formulaic. So it seemed also very useful for learners to familiarize themselves with these long multi-word units, lexical bundles. And finally, about corpus-informed teaching, I can also say that the findings of my study, and actually the corpus itself, has informed a course book, EU English, and they included not only the information, but also activities based on concordance lines. Now, the next way to use Corpora in language teaching is integrating corpus use in the actual classroom teaching. So in this case, it is already student learners, language learners, who are kind of researchers and look at information directly in the corpus. The theoretical underpinning for this is the noticing hypothesis and discovery learning, and the benefits of identifying patterns themselves, which help learners to remember these patterns more. In the literature now, we know it has been established that the benefits of data-driven learning, it often helps learners to develop their language awareness, but also their confidence and also autonomous learning in general. So let's see a couple of ways how my the information for my study can inform direct use of Corpora. Data-driven learning often asks learners to discover patterns. Often concordance lines are used, and we can make a distinction between teacher-directed and learner-led ways of using Corpora in language teaching. So first I will show a couple of ways where it's very much teacher-led, teacher identifying, for example, concordance lines that they would like to use in teaching. I think it's also important to think about how we present and what the kind of sequence of activities is. And here I would like to refer to Thurston and Candlin's suggestions about the sequence of activities where first learners would look at concordance lines, just think of the meaning of words and the context that they are used in, then familiarize themselves with the patterns of language surrounding the word. Then a next kind of stage could be practice. So they would use the words in different activities without referring to concordances, and then finally create their own piece of writing or maybe speaking using the specific words that they focused on. So today in my presentation, I would like to just share ideas for the looking and familiarizing stage, because the practicing and creating is not directly related to Corpora and can be very different in different contexts. So just activities for looking, just giving concordance lines, for example, in this case, the verb implement or the word commission, and see what are specifically, for example, what are the nouns and verbs, adjectives or adverbs used with these two words. Now, again, it might be specific to English for specific purposes. As I mentioned before, it might be useful to share information from the corpus about the difference of the general use of specific vocabulary items and the specific use in the specialized corpus. So in this case, this example demonstrates the word commission, which in the EU English corpus, as you can see from the examples, mainly refers to the Commission, one of the main institutions of the EU, and very little about the kind of financial meaning which would be prevalent in the general corpus, the BNC written this case. Another activity type for familiarizing learners with the meaning and usage of words could be, again, giving concordance lines and give them gap fill activities. And in this case, it is about using the implement and what are the adverbs that could be used in these specific sentences. This is another activity type for familiarizing learners with usage and meaning. In this case, it's the word criterion or criteria, and a gap fill with concordance lines where learners should identify the adjectives that kind of modify the meaning of criteria. I mentioned lexical bundles or multi-word units. These are examples for looking activities, just showing concordance lines with multi-word units. with the instructions of identifying patterns. Especially important might be here the position of lexical bundles within the sentence. And for example, they could identify that in accordance with is often used at the beginning of sentences. And then in the case of lexical bundles, it might be important to see the functions of lexical bundles. So this is an activity where learners are asked to identify what the lexical bundles refer to. Is it time, place, purpose, quality, or reference to another document? So these were the examples for kind of integrated corpus use. And the third way to use Corpora in language teaching is self-directed data-driven learning. And also we have examples for DIY Corpora. These have been also demonstrated in the literature that they work very well with language learners. And what I would like to share with you is how we used data-driven learning and also DIY Corpora in a corpus-based ESP course, actually focusing on EU English. So this was the course outline. As you can see, there are quite a few corpus tools and also available corpora that we showed the learners. And then there were different aspects of EU discourse that together with corpus tools were focused on in the different lessons. So the core aim was developing students' language skills, but also sensitize students to variation in lexicogrammatical features, raise their awareness to formulaic qualities of natural occurring language, and also we focused on autonomous language learning, and the aim was as well to provide a tool for students' long-term professional use. This was actually a small group of students who studied intercultural linguistic mediation. So their future careers might be as translators or people working in communication. There were actually 3 iterations of the course. So you can see this is a third iteration. We slightly changed the topics and the ways we presented corpus tools and presented different analysis of texts. We also asked students to develop their DIY corpora, and for this we demonstrated the use of Bootcat, which is a freely available corpus building tool. In the final third iteration of the course, we asked students to write essays which focused on the analysis that they carried out based on their DIY corpora, and also they reflected on the use of corpora in general. And we analyzed these essays with a corpus-based analysis, looking at keywords and what aspects of corpus use they refer to. So based on the analysis of these students, we identified the following kind of categories relating to corpus use. They wrote about advantages of using a language corpus. They also identify different affordances of corpus tools and resources. They also reported on enhanced language awareness. They did show a good understanding of the limitations of their DIY corpora and probably corpora in general. And they also wrote about future plans to use language corpora. So just very briefly about what they focused on in understanding the limitations of DIY corpora. They mentioned some of the disadvantages of using this corpora. Sometimes the corpus they created were very small, a couple of 10,000 words. and sometimes they didn't find the information that they were looking for. Also, future plans to use language corpora. A third of the students mentioned that explicitly, and they identified certain focuses like focusing on compiling an academic corpus or expanding their academic vocabulary, but also studying corpus compiling was a good way for them to better understand the use of language in general. So overall, this course suggests that students found this approach really useful, and the engagement with corpora seemed to help undergraduate students develop a deeper understanding of what corpora are, but also what kind of investigations they can carry out with the use of corpora. And also they had a deeper understanding of how language works in general. What is important to consider when we are applying a kind of DIY corpus approach, we set the minimum size of a DIY corpus as 50,000 running words. Maybe a higher number of this might result in more useful small corpora for learners. Also focusing on lexical grammatical aspects of language could also include comparisons based on online corpora in students L1, because what we found that, for example, the concept of collocation, they were not even familiar with in their own native language, and using L1 corpus helped them to do that as well. So just wrapping up about all the different ways to incorporate corpora in language teaching, you could see how this can be done based on a study focusing on a specific register. But we do see challenges of data-driven learning, and I just listed most of them that were mentioned in the literature and what we also kind of experienced with my colleague in these studies. So often it says it's time-consuming, technically challenging, there is maybe too much data for learners, scaffolding exercises are needed, and a gradual introduction of DDL and direct corpus use is recommended. So what I would like to highlight here is, for example, there is the concept of computer anxiety, using technology. Is there what we could call a corpus anxiety? And this is a short questionnaire that I asked of one of the groups. And it seems that it's not, students are not exhibiting very much corpus anxiety, but there are some aspects where they feel they would need more practice or more help with using corpora. So based on this, we kind of formulated what we called tentative principles of designing DDL-based language teaching. So start with introducing students with basic concepts of corpus linguistics, include components that focus specifically on technical skills, include both direct and indirect corpus use, guided scaffolded corpus consultation, allow sufficient time and repetition for hands-on corpus querying in class, include compiling and analyzing a DIY corpus, promote autonomous corpus use outside of the classroom. It's important to contextualize corpus use and also include components of reflection. So for example, contextualizations might include definitely materials that are pedagogically relevant and also demonstrate how that corpus use could be done in their professional lives as well. And reflection, you could ask and discuss questions like, or ask students to kind of finish sentences like corpora are good for, or corpora are not good for language learning because. So when we talk about using technology in language teaching, and this time I'm looking at Corpora as one type of technology, we also talk about normalization, and the stage, what we could call normalization, is, according to Bax, is when technology kind of becomes invisible and it is embedded in everyday practice. And there are a couple of impeding factors that Chambers, Bax, and also Paredes identified and analyzed, like logistics, stakeholder conceptions, or syllabus and software integration, and training development. So what I think we are probably lacking in data-driven learning and corpus use in language teaching is looking at models of integrations and acceptance of technology. So there are quite a few lessons that we could learn, for example, relating to learner training in computer-assisted language learning, or a general technology acceptance model that is often used in using any kind of technology in everyday life, or different models of integration that highlight the added value of using technology. So, and also usability evaluation of educational software, which are available in technology enhanced learning. So it would be useful when we create these corpus analysis tools and also integrate DDL activities in the learning to learn the lessons from these models. So future directions to help us cross the kind of research practice bridge. The more learning driven and teaching oriented corpora would be useful. Corpus analysis tools need to be more user friendly, and more work on pedagogic approaches, how to integrate corpus data and resources with overall teaching objectives are also needed. And finally, some research on the sociocultural but also cognitive mechanisms of what happens with learners while they are using corpora in direct corpus consultation. So I hope I managed to kind of demonstrate that it is possible to cross the bridge of the research and practice. And I hope you found the kind of practical ideas and approaches useful. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm open for any questions.
Well, thanks so much, Reka. Another really interesting talk for our series. Thanks so much for that. We've been taking a number of questions in the chat. Just before we go on to finish the recording for today, though, I will just bring up the poster for our next speaker, who is, I'll just bring up, sorry, now sees the emails. Here we are. Ellen Lafol, Research Associate and English Education Lecturer at Osnabrück University in Germany. And she will be presenting on why we need open science and open education to break the corpus practice gap. So do tune in for that next week. But for now, let's just everybody thank our speaker for today. And I'm going to cut the recording here before we get into our Q&A. So thanks everyone. I know it's difficult to hear the applause over Zoom, but rest assured, it is happening. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you same time, same day next week. Stay tuned for the Q&A.